Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next installation of our webinar series. This month's topic is sexual violence on university campuses. And just a couple of things before we get started with the actual content of the presentation. The first is to note that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory and also operates on Treaty 1 territory. And these territories comprise the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples. And these territories also comprise the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. Further, I'd just like to offer a warning that some of the content that you're about to hear might be upsetting for some folks, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause the playback if you need to do that. So rather than starting with definitions like we typically do, this time we're going to be starting with some statistics related to sexual violence on university campuses. So first, it's pretty well known that women and girls aged 15 to 24 experience the highest rates of sexual violence, and the latter half of that age range is typically the majority of university students. Of all graduate and undergraduate students, approximately 13% will experience sexual violence, and that number can vary as well to approximately 1 in 5 on the higher end of the scale. About 9.7% of female graduate students experience sexual violence, and 26.4% of female undergraduate students as well. Additionally, 5.8% of all students, both graduate and undergraduate, experience stalking, and stalking is an important aspect of gender-based violence that often goes undiscussed. In Manitoba, actually here, our Domestic Violence and Stalking Act explicitly includes stalking, as it is both an incredibly prevalent form of gender-based violence and also an incredibly insidious form of gender-based violence as well. Also to note, male students aged 18 to 24 were 78% more likely to experience sexual violence than men of the same age who are not students. In terms of help seeking, about 1 in 5 female survivors obtained help from victim services. That's not a huge number. And given that the rates of sexual violence are underreported, it makes the number of survivors actually seeking help relatively small compared to the actual number of people experiencing sexual violence. Additionally, 23.5% of 2S LGBTQ+ students have experienced sexual violence, which is an extremely high number. And additionally, 2S LGBTQ+ students may also experience unique barriers to help seeking as well on university campuses. Only 20% of female students who experienced sexual violence reported it to the police. We're going to talk about different types of reporting mechanisms, but just in general, reporting to police is not a common or super common thing for somebody who's experienced sexual assault or sexual violence. We know just that in the general population, around only 5% of sexual assaults will be reported to the police. So that's a very low number. 32% of non-student females who experienced sexual violence reported to the police, and more than half of all incidents of sexual violence or sexual assault on university campuses occurred in the first 4 months of the school year. Some statistics also state that the highest levels of sexual violence and sexual assault on university campuses happens actually within the first 8 weeks of the start of the school year. So, of course, based on those statistics, sexual violence and sexual assault on university campuses is clearly a very prominent problem, and it's also been the subject of much media attention. So, for example, there have been several books written about sexual violence on university campuses. One is Sexual Justice by Alexandra Brodsky, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Another is Had It Coming by Robin Doolittle, which also we're going to talk about in a little bit. And while that book is not entirely on sexual violence on university campuses, it does feature heavily. And probably one of the most well-known books about sexual violence on university campuses is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. We're going to talk about the case that prompted the writing of that book. And it's actually a very well-known case. You probably have already heard of it, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. Sexual violence on university campuses has also grabbed the attention of news media. So whether it's news media on TV or social media or things like that, whenever cases of sexual violence or sexual assault on college or university campuses comes up, it really tends to grab the attention of the news media. So for example, the Western University sexual violence cases, which we're going to talk about, cases of UBC sexual violence, and the Brock Turner case. Most of the cases that I'm going to be talking about and examples that I'm going to be giving are in the Canadian context, just because we are a Canadian organization, but the problem is very similar in the States as well. So a lot of the information is transferable, and a lot of the cases are comparable to ones that have been seen in the United States as well. And there's also been a documentary film on sexual violence on, I believe it's American college campuses. But again, the situations are very similar and a lot of the information is quite transferable. The film is called The Hunting Ground and it was released in 2015. We're not going to get too much into that, again, just because it is based in the American context. But if you wanted to watch it, it is available online. And essentially the premise of the documentary film is that it categorizes sexual violence and assault on college campuses as a crisis, and it kind of delves more in depth into why that is. So as I mentioned, when sexual assault and sexual violence cases on university campuses happen, they tend to grab the attention of the news media. One of the most prominent examples that we've had here in Canada is Western University. Western University is in Ontario, and a few years ago, there were allegations that approximately 20 to 30 students who were overwhelmingly, if not entirely female, had been drugged and sexually assaulted during a party. Western University has quite the reputation for being what's called a party school. So during the first few weeks of the new school year, there tend to be quite a lot of parties, both related to the Greek fraternity system and also outside of that as well. This particular incident occurred also during the first few weeks of school, September 2021. And once these allegations surfaced, this was after 4 separate sexual assaults had been reported just a week before. So this was a kind of a huge spate of allegations of sexual violence that were reported within a relatively short period of time. These allegations of the 20 to 30 students had prompted a mass walkout of 10,000 students on Western University's campus who were demanding accountability, rightly so, and an end to sexual violence on campus, and essentially for administrators to take the problem seriously. In March of 2022, Western University Student Council declared a crisis of sexual and gender-based violence on campus. 2 separate reports were conducted and a series of recommendations were made, a lot of which were overlapping. Those recommendations are available online. They're not particularly relevant to the discussion that we're having here today, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But essentially, after these reports were conducted and the recommendations were made, university administrators did admit that there was what they called a culture problem at play at Western University. And what they mean by that is a rape culture problem and a culture of sexual violence that was, of course, causing a problem for these many students who had experienced sexual violence on campus. Another prominent example that was in the news quite a lot, this one was a little further back, but it was in British Columbia at UBC. So in 2014, UBC staff received approximately half a dozen complaints from separate individuals of sexual violence, alleging that one particular graduate student, PhD student, was the perpetrator of all of these separate incidents. The instances of sexual violence were said to have been committed beginning in 2013 and then continuing on. When the survivors approached university staff, they said that they had felt dismissed. They were told not to speak about what had happened to them. And it took UBC up until 2015 to engage in any type of action regarding holding the perpetrator accountable or engaging in any kind of process for remedying these acts. And after, action was finally engaged, the perpetrator was actually expelled in 2015. And probably one of the most prominent cases of sexual violence on college and university campuses was the Brock Turner case. So this case occurred at a party, I believe it was a fraternity-related party at Stanford University, where Turner, the accused, had drugged and sexually assaulted who was referred to at the time as Jane Doe behind a dumpster, and then he left her after two other students intervened and were able to help Jane Doe and kind of scare Turner away. The rhetoric surrounding the court case was subject of a lot of criticism, and you're going to see why. The court case itself was grounded in a lot of sympathy for Turner, who had, he was witnessed by several people committing these acts of sexual assault and sexual violence, but still there was quite a lot of sympathy actually for Turner. His father made a statement before the court suggesting that punishment for his crime, if Turner were to be punished for the crime, would be a, quote, steep price to pay for 20 minutes of action in his 20 years of life. So that's really indicative of the culture of victim blaming that is still very persistent within American society as well as Canadian society surrounding sexual assault, the kind of excusing of sexual assault based on rape myths. So things like it was just a miscommunication, that's a rape myth, and that's kind of what the father was alluding to here, was that it was, like it was nothing, it was just a misunderstanding. And those rape myths have extreme negative consequences on not only the court process, but also on the survivors themselves. The defense and the witnesses called on the defense's behalf relied heavily on these rape myths, including framing the assault around alcohol consumption and kind of using that as, I guess excuse would be the best term, but, saying that, because of the alcohol consumption at parties, they were kind of framing sexual violence stemming from that alcohol consumption as inevitable. And again, they relied very heavily on framing the assault as an accident, quote unquote, which is a very common rape myth as well, saying that, it was just a miscommunication or he didn't mean to, or things like that, meant to kind of remove accountability from the perpetrator. The survivor, who up to this point had been known as Jane Doe, as she did not want her name released or associated with the case, she wrote a victim impact statement that was read before the court. And this victim impact statement had a huge impact not only on the court itself, but around the world as well. It was picked up by news media outlets. It was shared widely online. And after the conclusion of the trial, she actually went on to write a book under her own name, which is Chanel Miller. That was the book that I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. It's called Know My Name, and it's about her experience of the assault, how it affected her afterwards, how grueling the trial was for her, and how she feels that no justice really was served in that case, as Brock Turner was sentenced, I believe, to 6 months in prison and was released before that sentence was up. So those are probably the most prominent cases of sexual violence or assault in the news media, but it's also been written about in books, and I'm going to share with you a couple of really good books that have been written on sexual violence or assault on university campuses. These are really good resources that kind of explain, the processes of investigations, the processes of creating sexual violence policies, as well as kind of the underlying cultures that perpetuate sexual violence and assault on college campuses. So the first one we're going to talk about is called Sexual Justice by Alexandra Brodsky. If you can see that, it looks like this. It analyzes how cases of sexual harassment are handled in institutions like schools and workplaces. So outside of the court setting, outside of the legal system setting. While sexual violence on college and university campuses isn't the sole focus of the book, it's a huge part of it. Brodsky was one of the key players in the No Year 9 movement in the United States, which aimed to educate about students' legal right to be free from sex-based discrimination under Title IX. And she was a huge part of getting college and university campuses in the United States to adopt sexual violence policies that adequately balanced the rights of the survivor and the accused, as previously these rights were quite unbalanced and tended to skew quite heavily in favor of the accused, and created a culture of impunity, really, for people who committed sexual violence or were alleged to have committed sexual violence on college and university campuses. The absence of a policy really kind of let a lot of people off the hook and didn't provide a safe working and learning environment. It didn't provide any sense of justice or resolution for the survivors. And that's a huge part of this book, is discussing the importance of due process, and the balancing of the rights of the survivor and the accused. And one of the things that Brodsky notes right off the bat is this idea of due process rhetoric, and how that has been kind of misused by anti-feminist individuals and groups to kind of assert that sexual violence policies on college and university campuses have what they call overcorrected and now skew heavily in favor of the rights of the survivor, which is just patently false. If you read the actual book, she outlines why that is. And she notes that, due process is a legal term that is valid in courts of law. But since these institutions like schools and workplaces have policies and procedures that, do not happen in courts of law, that principle of due process doesn't apply. It's a legal term. So what she's saying is that what people really should be seeking is procedural fairness, and the balancing of the rights of the survivor and the accused, because these institutions, workplaces, schools, they're not courts of law, and they shouldn't be operating like courts of law. There are often civil procedures or criminal procedures happening in courts of law in tandem with the investigations happening in schools and workplaces. And those civil and criminal proceedings are where the idea of due process should come in, not in institutions like schools and workplaces, which should be focused on procedural fairness and balancing the rights of the survivor and the accused. The book also outlines how universities can craft their policies to make the process of reporting sexual abuse on campuses as straightforward as possible, and limiting things like re-traumatization and things like that, showing how many of the policies that existed protected the impunity of perpetrators, which of course comes at the expense of survivors, and how also the lack of sexual violence policies also protects perpetrators to the expense of survivors. A second book that is also an excellent resource for folks looking to learn more about sexual violence and kind of processes for handling allegations is Had It Coming by Robin Doolittle. It looks like this. It's become a very popular book within the last few years. Robin Doolittle herself is an investigative reporter who became quite well known for her Unfounded series, which ran in the Globe and Mail. The Unfounded series was a long-form journalism piece coming out in multiple parts that detailed the unfounded statistics of sexual assault in Canada. So unfounded in terms of sexual assault means that the police don't have enough evidence to prove that a crime happened. It doesn't mean that the crime didn't happen, but there's not enough evidence to have it stand up in a court of law. So those cases are deemed unfounded. And because of the nature of sexual assault, where the crime scene essentially is somebody's body, having physical evidence can be difficult. And in a lot of times that physical evidence doesn't exist. So evidence is reliant on the testimony of the survivor, as well as the testimony of the accused. And unfortunately, the testimony of survivors, as we know, is oftentimes disbelieved or discounted. devalued. So Robin Doolittle wrote an entire series on unfounded statistics of sexual assault in Canada. It's excellent. You should definitely look it up online. It's widely available. So Had It Coming is the book that came out after her Unfounded series, and it kind of expands on a lot of the ideas that she touched on there. And it analyzes different aspects of how allegations of sexual assault are handled in Canada, in the justice system, in the court of public opinion, and also in institutions like universities. So some highlights that she talks about in the book include talking about the lack of understanding of what constitutes sexual violence by actors like police and judges. So she actually found that in a lot of cases, justice system actors don't fully understand what constitutes sexual assault, and that plays into how they're able to do their jobs. She also talks about how different generations view sexual violence, and how that impacts reporting, how it impacts outcomes and supports. She talks about the myth of false allegations. As we know, a lot of times the media, the public tend to focus on the incredibly small percentage of allegations of sexual assault that are false. The numbers are around only 2 to 3% of allegations are false. So, people tend to really rely on this myth of false allegations to kind of discredit survivors and sow disbelief. She talks about how powerful men can be accused of sexual assault time and time again and face no consequences. And she talks about the cases of course, Harvey Weinstein. And in the Canadian context, she talks about Gian Ghomeshi. She also talks about the ways that Canada's comparatively strong sexual assault laws are not properly enforced. So Canada actually has on the books some of the strongest sexual assault laws in the world, but unfortunately those laws are not properly enforced due to things like what I mentioned earlier about justice system actors not properly understanding what sexual assault and sexual violence is. Different ways that sexual violence is viewed by different generations. So all those things kind of come together to feed into a culture where sexual assault laws are not properly enforced by those whose job it is to do that. Another thing that she does specifically related to sexual violence on college and university campuses is she shows how pervasive rape culture is in those situations, particularly in the Canadian case, which I think is good because a lot of the literature that discusses sexual violence on college and university campuses is focused on the American context. So it's excellent to have a resource that focuses a lot of attention on the Canadian context. And she talks about how little is being done to combat this rape culture. We're going to talk a little bit about the policies and procedures that are in place in some Manitoba universities in a minute, but those are things that aren't regularly enforced across the board. Doolittle also highlights how universities are struggling to balance the rights of the accused and survivors through the institution of policies and procedures, trying to figure out how to incorporate trauma-informed practice to minimize the risk of re-traumatization when survivors go to disclose or report. And she also mentions how universities are also struggling to handle backlash from anti-feminist groups and individuals. As I mentioned when I was talking about Alexandra Brodsky's book, there are groups and individuals who argue that sexual violence policies and procedures on university campuses have swung the pendulum too far in favor of the rights of the survivor, and have kind of used this very anti-feminist idea to be critical of even having sexual violence policies and procedures in the first place. And this is something that universities are having to deal with en masse. So let's talk about a little bit of consent culture on campuses, as this is an issue that kind of feeds into the perpetration of sexual assault and sexual violence on campuses. So the Canadian Federation of Students, which is an advocacy group that advocates for college and university students, they define consent culture as a culture in which the prevailing narrative of sex is centered on mutual understanding, respect, and agreement of each other's desires and limitations. It is the culture that does not force anyone into anything, respects bodily autonomy, and is based on the belief that a person is always the best judge of their own wants and needs. So this comes from a kind of like a paper that the Canadian Federation of Students published. It's available on their website about consent culture on campuses, about the issue of sexual violence and assault on university campuses. They state that, you know, having a lack of a consent culture on college and university campuses is one of the key things that feeds into the presence of sexual violence and assault on university campuses, because without consent culture, that just fosters a situation where sexual violence and assault not only occur, but occur with impunity and where there is no accountability. They reference a survey that said that male students still often harbor highly problematic attitudes about sexual violence, which again contributes to that culture, of gender-based violence. And this is when they say male students, they're meaning men between the ages of approximately 18 to 25. They also reference another survey that was done not that long ago that found that 20% of male students believed forced sex was acceptable if somebody spent money on a date, if the person's date was under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or if the individuals have been dating for a long time. So that's an example of those highly problematic attitudes around sexual violence, and also contribute to that culture of gender-based violence, because in all of those situations that final quote there mentions, those would all be instances of sexual assault. Believing that somebody is entitled to sex because of money spent on a date, that would be sexual assault. Engaging in sexual activity with somebody who's under the influence of drugs or alcohol, that would constitute sexual assault as well. You know, forcing somebody into sex because you've been in a dating relationship for a long time, also sexual assault. So all of those things, of course, foster that culture on university campuses. All right, so it was found that a huge problem is that while many colleges and universities in Canada now have sexual violence policies and procedures, many staff and students don't actually know what's in them. They don't know what their rights are, and that kind of impedes people from being able to claim those rights and from being able to seek the help that they need, because a lot of times they don't know that they can, or they don't know where to go. So we're going to talk about university sexual violence policies in general, and then we're going to turn to sexual violence policies and procedures at Brandon University, University of Manitoba, and University of Winnipeg. So, for example, in 2014, only 9 of 78 Canadian universities had standalone sexual violence policies, which, of course, is just an abysmal rate of sexual violence policies, seeing as how it's such a crisis. Eventually, provinces who are responsible for post-secondary education began mandating by law that universities have to have sexual violence policies, and Ontario was the first province to do that in 2018. However, Manitoba quickly followed later in 2016, and we now have the Sexual Violence Awareness and Prevention Act, which mandates that accredited colleges and universities in Manitoba have to have sexual violence policies and procedures that set out you know, what the responsibilities of the university are, responding to disclosures, initiating investigations, all those kind of things. And we're going to get into that in a minute. However, just because universities now have these policies, it doesn't mean, again, that staff or students know what's in them. And that's a huge problem for actually supporting survivors or people who want to make a report, because if people don't know that there is a policy, or they don't know what's in it, or they don't know their rights under the policy, then they can't effectively claim their rights, and they can't access necessarily the supports that they need. So data on the successes and challenges of sexual violence policies is only sporadically collected, and evaluations are only, periodically done. There's no centralized database for all of this information, which makes it difficult for students, prospective students, and the general public to know how well universities are handling this issue. And the issue of public accountability is really important because universities are public institutions. They spend public money, and so they are accountable to the general public. So it's important, not only for students to know how well their university is handling the issues of sexual violence and how well the university is prepared to ensure their safety, but also for the general public to know that as well. So Dr. Karen Busby, who is a professor at the University of Manitoba at Robson Hall, which is the law school, she does a lot of research on equality provisions in Canadian law. She does research on gender-based violence, on LGBTQ plus issues, and she did an environmental scan of sorts in 2018 of the existing sexual violence policies in Canadian universities. So this included universities not only in Manitoba but across the country, and she found that most policies, for example, will recognize the university's obligations both legally and ethically to provide a safe working and learning environment. She also found mention of intersectionality in most policies. She outlined what makes a good sexual violence policy, and then, here's a list of most of the things. So things like the accommodations process, what happens if there are also criminal proceedings happening at the same time as a university investigation, what relationship needs to exist between the perpetrator, survivor, and university for the university to take action in a particular instance of sexual violence or assault. Deciding who is going to be making the decisions, outlining measures of confidentiality and privacy, what other policies and legislation will interact with the sexual violence policy, so provincial privacy laws, university bylaws, university policies on respectful, safe work and learning environments, collective agreements, all of those kinds of things, articulating the rights of the survivor and the accused, defining what resolutions are available, and measures for public accountability. Dr. Busby also found that most of the policies reviewed differentiated clearly between a disclosure and a report, as well as differentiated between different types of reports that might be available. And we're going to talk about the difference between a disclosure and a report when we get into the specific examples of Manitoba universities. She found that most of the policies also restrict or prohibit information sharing between parties to the claim or to outside parties, some to the point of threatening punishment should the restriction or prohibition be broken. We're going to talk about this a little bit when we get to, I believe it's the University of Winnipeg, but these kinds of prohibitions on information have implications not only for procedural fairness, but also for rights of the survivor and the accused, and also for public accountability. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Most policies state that either survivors do not have to be updated or are not to be updated on the resolution of the investigation, or they don't say anything around that at all and are kind of mum on that point. Most policies also don't have adequate provisions for data collection or evaluation. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, inadequate evaluation measures, inadequate data collection, and kind of a lack of that centralized database is really an impediment to public accountability to students and staff. And Dr. Busby goes into quite a bit of detail talking about how important it is for universities to have that data collected to consistently do evaluations in order to ensure that the policies are working how they're supposed to be working. So let's get into some of the universities in Manitoba that have sexual violence policies. I chose 3 of the biggest universities in the province. Brandon University, of course, because the Women's Resource Center is a Brandon-based organization. University of Manitoba, because it's the biggest university in the province, and University of Winnipeg, because a lot of students from outside of Winnipeg go to the University of Winnipeg as well as the University of Manitoba. And I just wanted to ensure that, if there were any high school students watching or students who might be thinking of switching to the U of M or the U of W, that you have the information available to you about what the sexual violence policies and procedures look like. Because as I mentioned before, when students and staff don't know about the policies or what's in the policies, they don't know what their rights are. It's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for them to claim those rights and for them to get the help they need. So that's why we're going to be going through these policies, so you have the information available to you should you need it. Hopefully not, but in case you do, you have it. So Brandon University, their website is, I went through their website, I went through their policy, and I went through their procedure, and I've kind of coalesced that information into these few slides. So Brandon University has a sexual violence education and prevention coordinator who handles disclosures and reports. They have online reporting options available through REASE, Respect, Educate, Empower Survivors. And they cite the benefits of an online reporting portal as providing a written record of the incident, and also giving survivors options like anonymous reporting, police reporting, and being connected to resources. So let's see here. BU's website also gives some information on, what to do if somebody receives a report or disclosure of sexual violence. So a disclosure of sexual violence just means telling somebody that you trust about the violence that you've experienced. And a report is a more formal process where there is then going to be paperwork that's filled out. There's going to be a written record and potentially an investigation might be launched from that report. So a disclosure is very informal. It's essentially telling somebody that you trust what happened to you, and a report is, having it in writing and added to kind of the record, so to speak. The website has limited information on topics like bystander intervention, consent, and rape culture, which are three crucial aspects of sexual violence on campuses and universities. Oftentimes, consent education doesn't happen that great in the high school setting, and the university setting is usually no better. A lot of times there are, at the beginning of the year, there'll be workshops or lectures on consent and rape culture and bystander intervention, but they're not mandatory, and honestly, a lot of students don't go to them. So it would have been nice to have a little bit more information, on those topics on the website, just so it's accessible for students, given that, people tend not to go to those free seminars or lectures. The policy itself was instituted in 2017. So after Manitoba instituted the Sexual Violence Awareness and Prevention Act in 2016, they gave all post-secondary institutions until sometime in 2017 to have their policy in force. So Brandon University's came into force in 2017. It was last reviewed in 2018, as that is something that the Act stipulates, is that the policies and procedures for post-secondary institutions with respect to specifically to sexual violence and assault have to be reviewed on a regular basis. The policy itself was up for review again in 2021, but the most up-to-date policy is still from 2018 on the website. So I don't know if that's something that was postponed due to COVID or if it's under review now, but regardless, the most up-to-date policy available online was still from 2018. The website recognizes the importance, and the policy itself actually recognizes the importance, though not obligation, interestingly, of providing a safe working and learning environment. The policy also recognizes the importance of an intersectional approach, a trauma-informed approach, and survivor-centered approach. So both of those two bullet points go back to what Dr. Busby found in her environmental scan, where she found that most of the policies did note those two things. So they note that there's an obligation or an importance to providing a safe working and learning environment, as well as recognizing the importance of that intersectional and trauma-informed approach. The policy defines consent in much more detail than the website does. It takes up almost a whole page. Would have been nice to have that information on the website as well, but it is defined in the policy. The policy somewhat differentiates between disclosures and types of reports, but it could be a little bit more in depth. So again, the disclosure is telling somebody you trust about what happened to you, but there's no written record of it. It doesn't trigger any kind of investigation, and it's not formalized in any way. And a report is formalized. It's a written record. It may trigger an investigation or a police investigation. And the different types of reports that are usually found, there's a university report where you report it to the university, and then the university will determine if they need to do an investigation. There's a police report, of course, which is probably the type of report that people are most familiar with, where you report to the police, and they take a statement from you, and they determine whether there is enough evidence to lay a charge. And then there's also medical reporting. So oftentimes survivors' first point of contact after experiencing an assault is the hospital or the clinic. And in those situations, a report can be taken there through like the medical forensic examination. The Brandon University policy also outlines possible corrective actions, and it was interesting to me to read that their policy states that corrective actions can be taken even if no policy breach is found. So if there's an investigation that's done and it's found that no university policy relating to sexual violence or assault was breached, there still may be room to institute some kind of corrective action or resolution. It also outlines the procedure for maintenance of statistics for an annual report, which, as Dr. Busby outlined in her article, is an important piece of ensuring that sexual violence policies are working the way that they're supposed to be working, and also for that student and public accountability piece. The policy also lists supports and resources for survivors both on and off campus. The Women's Resource Center is listed as an off-campus support, as well as some other organizations and campus groups. And the policy also articulates the roles and responsibilities of actors and kind of very clearly sets out kind of what everybody's responsible for, so the different roles within the university, from the sexual violence education and prevention coordinator to professors to staff members. All of those roles and responsibilities with specific respect to sexual violence and assault are listed. Brandon University also has a sexual violence protocol, which works in tandem with the policy. And essentially, the protocol just lays out the exact procedures for things in much more detail. So, for example, BU's protocol lists things like procedures for supporting survivors, for confidentiality, for disclosures and reporting, and also for the university's investigation and report procedures as well. So I think the final thing that I've got mentioned here for Brandon University is it somewhat defines the sexual violence response team on campus. It's good that they have that, and it's just really a very small contingent of university staff that can get together and decide how best to support survivors, how best to connect them with resources, all of those kinds of things. All right, so moving on to the University of Manitoba, again, I reviewed their website, their policy, and their protocol. So their website states that no report is required to access supports, which is good. It could just be a disclosure. If somebody doesn't want to make a report, they can still access supports. And I just wanted to note quickly here that the University of Manitoba did have the most in-depth website related to sexual assault. So there's going to be quite a bit more information here than there was for Brandon University, and more information than there will be for the University of Winnipeg when we get to it next. The U of M differentiates between the disclosure and multiple reporting options. The multiple reporting options being reporting to the university, reporting to police, and reporting to medical professionals. The website also offers reasons why somebody would and potentially would not want to report, in an effort kind of, I guess, to destigmatize the reporting process and to understand that, there are a lot of reasons why people might opt to do a disclosure rather than a report. It gives tips on what to do if you're not sure if you want to report, kind of the things that maybe you could consider that might help you decide if you wanted to report or not. It also lists on-campus resources for students, so like various student groups or the on-campus counseling services. It also briefly mentions third-party reporting and lists the third-party reporting agencies in Winnipeg. So that's a good thing as well, because third-party reporting is often, not discussed as often as it should be, as it's a really good program for people who have experienced sexual violence. They might, for a multitude of reasons, not want to report to the police. So third-party reporting is a good option and something that's really good to, remind folks of, is to make sure that they're aware of. So when university reports are made, they're made to the Office of Human Rights and Conflict Management or to Security Services. And the U of M's Sexual Violence Resource Center can help survivors walk through that process and kind of give them an idea of what to expect and help them fill out the forms and all of those kinds of things. It also lists police reporting resources, so Winnipeg Police, RCMP, all of those kinds of things, and it gives a brief overview of what to expect when making a police report, which I think is beneficial because a lot of people don't know what to expect, and that can be honestly a deterrent for a lot of folks. Is it can feel like a really big and scary thing to make a police report, and not knowing what to expect can exacerbate that. So kind of just helping people understand what goes into making a police report could be helpful. And then also goes on to provide a brief synopsis of the procedure for making a university report. So the Sexual Violence Resource Center at the University of Manitoba can help students decide whether or not they want to make a report or disclosure, can help them get connected to resources. Staff and students wanting to make a report can get help from the Sexual Violence Resource Center with putting that together and then taking it to the Office of Human Rights and Conflict Management or to Security Services. Informal resolutions are also an option for those who don't want to make a formal report. So that's kind of similar to the Brandon University thing, where, if it's found that there was no breach of policy, there can still be kind of some informal resolutions that can be made. If a formal report is made and it is found through an investigation, however, that university policy was breached, the disciplinary actions will vary, and those are outlined in the protocol. We're not going to go through all of them. It's not super relevant to the discussion that we're having, but it is available online if somebody did want to have a look. The website also lists on and off-campus resources for counseling and safety planning as well. However, it provides only minimal educational resources on sexual assault. So it would be good to beef those up a little bit. And it does provide some information on how to help somebody who has experienced sexual assault, so that kind of peer support aspect. So U of M sexual violence policy was first instituted in 2017. It was last updated in, that should say 2020. That should say 2020, and it's up for review in 2023, so next summer, I believe. The policy, as it states, it aims to articulate university guidelines around sexual violence, create a framework for guiding, assisting, and supporting those who have experienced sexual violence or have received a disclosure, setting out a consistent process for handling disclosures and reports, formal and informal, highlighting importance of a trauma-informed approach and of intersectionality. There are sections on understanding the rights and responsibilities of all stakeholders, so not only university actors and staff, but also the accused and the reporter. It stipulates the continuation of education and training around sexual violence. It defines in quite a lot of detail things like consent, sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual violence, and a few more. And also it outlines the autonomy of the reporter and kind of taking that survivor-centered approach to this whole process. So the University of Winnipeg is the final institution in Manitoba that we're going to be discussing today. Their website had a decent amount of information. For example, it had information on understanding sexual violence, definitions of sexual violence, definitions of consent, rape culture, intersectionality, and it also outlines some myths and realities of sexual violence to kind of debunk some of the misinformation that exists out there. It gives information on reporting sexual violence. It also differentiates between disclosure and report, gives available resources and outlines confidentiality, which again goes back to the article that Dr. Busby wrote, where she found that most university policies will do this. University of Winnipeg does this as well. Unfortunately, it only has minimal information on supporting survivors. It would be good to see more of that. It also lists resources on and off campus. And the university also has a sexual violence response team, which, similar to Brandon University, is a small contingent of university staff that's able to help survivors get connected to resources, to help them through the process as a whole, and to kind of get them access to supports. So the University of Winnipeg's policy has a purpose of policy section at the beginning that outlines consistent procedures for dealing with disclosures. The policy itself also recognizes the impacts of rape culture and the importance of intersectionality. Again, going back to the article that Dr. Busby wrote, finding that these were in most university policies. U of W's policy highlights the importance of education, awareness, and prevention. And also outlines when the university can get involved in an investigative disclosure or report. It also clearly articulates the rights of the survivor and the accused, which Dr. Busby cited as something that is important and is an aspect of a good policy. Unfortunately, the University of Winnipeg's confidentiality policy does place quite strict limits on communication, and survivors could easily become confused about what they can and can't speak about. So for example, survivors, they can't even say whether there is an investigation or not. They can't post anything online about the existence of the investigation. They can't share, if there is an investigation done, they can't share any information that was learned only through the investigation. And their confidentiality policy does state that breaches of the confidentiality policy could be viewed as retaliation, and may be punished, which is unfortunate, that, you know, these confidentiality procedures need to fairly balance the rights of all of the stakeholders involved to ensure that nobody is gagged or you know, prevented from speaking. The policy states that, you know, the survivor or the accused is allowed to speak of their experiences, but they, you know, again, they can't confirm or deny that there's an investigation. They can't post anything online about any kind of investigation, even if, you know, to acknowledge that one exists, things like that. So again, it's easily possible that survivors could be confused about what they can and can't speak about. They might inadvertently breach the policy and then might be subject to punishment after that. However, it is important to note that the university's sexual violence support office would be able to help survivors understand the policy, so that, you know, those inadvertent breaches don't happen, and, you know, they are aware of what they can and can't speak about. It's just unfortunate that, you know, it is as strict as it is quite limiting. So the sexual violence procedure document that goes along with the policy stipulates in detail the process of taking a disclosure and what that entails. So again, the disclosure is the informal way of telling somebody what happened, and from there being able to access resources. The procedure also articulates the process of reporting, which is the more formal way of stating what happened and having a paper record for it. And then from a report that may initiate a university investigation, from a police report that may initiate a criminal investigation. The sexual violence procedure document also has requirements for keeping records and statistics, which Dr. Busby cited as being critically important for ensuring that evaluation is happening as it should be, and that policies are updated so that, you know, they're the most effective. In terms of privacy, within the sexual violence procedure document itself, this document states that the survivor can know that the accused was disciplined, but they're not entitled to know what those measures are necessarily, unless the disciplinary measure is something like the accused has to stay a certain distance from the survivor. That is unfortunate because that would really impact the survivor's sense of justice of the whole process. It could really affect their perception of the entire process. But yeah, that is stipulated within the procedure document itself. And this procedure document, as well as the policy itself, since they were instituted at the same time, they were supposed to be reviewed in 2022, this past summer, but the most up-to-date information on the website is still from 2018. So I don't know whether, the policy and procedure are under review at the moment, or, if that was postponed. I'm not too sure, but the most up-to-date information on the website is still from 2018. Okay, so that is our webinar for today. As always, I will leave our contact information at the end of the slide here so that anybody who needs to contact us can feel free to do so. Thanks for sticking around, and our next webinar will be in the new year.